Hello, today I'll be discussing my term project for English 310. The film No Country for Old Men is a 2007 film directed by the Coen brothers. It's a neo-western film based off a book of the same name written by Cormac McCarthy. The story follows three main characters during a Mexican drug deal gone wrong in the 1980s in rural Texas. The three main characters are Anton Chigurh. He's the villain, or what many would consider the villain of the movie. Llewellyn Moss is what you could say would be the protagonist, although there's some dispute as to that. And then Sheriff Ed Tom Bell. So each of these characters, so the two characters I'm going to focus on, Sheriff Ed Tom Bell and Anton Chigurh, are significant from a deconstructionist standpoint because they present two vantage points which contain conflicts or tensions or dichotomies that I'm going to deconstruct. So Sheriff Ed Tom Bell is the veteran sheriff. In the film, it says that he says that he's been sheriff since he was 25, and he speaks very positively from the beginning of the film about the old-time sheriffs. He remarks some of the old-time sheriffs didn't even wear a gun, and how he always loved to hear about the old-timers. He tends to think that the old times were better, that morality was more straightforward, that good was able to beat evil. So he looks fondly on the old days and derides the modern days, thinking that they're full of senseless violence and cruelty that the modern times simply didn't have, at least according to his perspective. We don't really see, he doesn't play a large role in the first half of the movie, but we can see throughout the film that he's constantly horrified by many of the violent crimes he investigates, and some of the crimes he witnesses, and he thinks it's all very senseless, and is wondering, what the purpose is in all these things. And so he relies on this dichotomy to bring meaning and order into the world, but throughout the movie, we can see that this worldview, this distinction between the old ways and the new ways, or the good old days and the modern times, it's not a real thing. It's not a real aspect. It's a social construction that Tom Bell and many other people use. Earlier in the film, he's seen speaking to a young sheriff about a horrific crime in which it sounds like the persons committing the crime brainwashed the victims to think they were dogs, and were found with only wearing a dog collar. And the younger sheriff deputy, he sort of laughs, but he says, "Oh, go ahead and laugh because I did too, because I can't make any sense of it." So as the film progresses, we see that he's no longer fully believing the old way. But the turning point in his character development comes when he visits Ellis. And Ellis is much older than him, and he's the time-hardened, wise old man, so to speak. He shed all his idealism, and he sees reality more as it is than as it could be. And in one important line, Ed says, "I always figured when I got older, God would come into my life somehow, but he didn't." And ultimately, Ed feels like he should be the hero. He should be one of the old-timers, as he says, who goes in to save the day. But Ellis sets him straight and says, "Well, you're just being egoistic. It's all vanity. That's not the way it works." And then he proceeds to give probably the best counterexample to the stories of the good old days, or the old-timers who were very heroic and who were able to do everything well, he gives a counterexample and tells the story of his Uncle Mac's death, which is ignominious and really just pointless. He's shot with a shotgun and simply bleeds to death before he can even shoot back at the people who attacked him. And then at the very end of the film, we see that Ed has had two dreams, and the second dream is most revealing. He describes riding on horseback with his father, who's been deceased for a very long time, and his father rides with a blanket over his body and a horn of fire in his hand, and he doesn't look at him as he rides by him. The weather is cold and dark, and his father just rides past him. And then Ed says that he feels that his father was riding past him to set up a fire so that when he caught up to him, he would be able to find the fire and take refuge and become warm. Then he says that he woke up from the dream. Now, there are many ways to interpret this, but I think given the evidence, I can't go through it all here, it's reasonable to interpret it as such. That the good old days, that Ed's father represents the old-timers and the old morality, carrying the torch of justice, the horn of fire, so that he might bring justice into the world. But when Ed wakes up, he realizes that it was all a dream. It was just a dream. The good old days never existed, and morality was never the way he thought it was. It was simply an idea. It was something imagined. So it shows that ultimately this distinction between the old times and the modern times is basically a fiction. Now to the second character, Anton Chigurh. His character provides the dichotomy between free will and determinism. Early on we learn that Chigurh is a psychopathic killer. He uses an air gun to dispatch innocent victims, and he does this without remorse or pleasure. He uses a coin flip to determine the fate of many of his victims. But during these exchanges, he reveals that his worldview, the distinction between free will and determinism, it doesn't really exist. Near the end of the movie, he flips a coin to determine the fate of Clara Jean, Llewellyn's wife, widowed. She refuses to play by the rules, saying the coin doesn't have a say. She's perplexed at Chigurh's philosophy, and she just calls him crazy. And even though Chigurh still kills her at the end, it reveals how the dichotomy between free will and determinism begins to fall apart. Now, Chigurh thinks that he's acting completely deterministically. He argues that the coin got here just the same way that I did. So, he believes that the coin is a purely deterministic decider of fate. But while there's certain parts of Chigurh's murders that are deterministic, they all involve some agency. The choice to use the coin to determine a fate is still a choice, ultimately. It still took some agency on Chigurh. And all the deliberations he makes, which kind of gun he's going to use, how he's going to approach his victims, are all intentional events. So there's a contradiction here between free will and determinism. And I'd argue that beneath the veneer of objectivity that Chigurh believes is part of his philosophy, we could see that much of it's just a cover for an egoistic view of the world, where he hides himself behind these deterministic fates, but at the same time he's actually just a bad faith. He's practicing bad faith because he's actually forcing the individuals choosing which side on the coin toss. He's basically pushing the decision on them rather than himself. So ultimately, he's actually acting in bad faith. Both dichotomies, as I've shown, have been constructed by the characters. They have no real existence within reality. They're tools that the characters use to get on through their lives and through a world that's quite strange. Even though they use these ideas, these abstract ideas, either of the good days, the old days versus the modern times, or between free will and determinism, they use these, and their lives and their actions become largely dependent on them, both the sheriff and Chigurh, and as a result, they lack freedom. However, some of the other characters, in particular Llewellyn Moss, represents sort of someone who lives primarily within the concrete, or by the concrete aspects of reality, rather than relying solely on these ideas, rather than being bound by these ideas. And although he takes many morally ambiguous actions, he's actually the person within the story who shows the most compassion, both in trying to save his wife and then also in attempting to bring water to the injured Mexican. Ultimately, to conclude, I would argue that this film, from a deconstructive standpoint, can serve as an admonition to philosophers to focus on the real and concrete as paths to morality, rather than simply using abstract ideas. Because ultimately, both the sheriff and Chigurh use abstract ideas to make their way through the world and to make decisions. For the most part, the sheriff's actions are, he attempts to do good, but one could say that he doesn't do enough, whereas Chigurh does a lot of things that are quite bad, but using various ideas that he believes to be true. Ultimately, this is a warning. This film serves as a warning to people who become too interested in simply binding themselves to one idea rather than allowing the complexity of life to inform their choices and decisions.